Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm here with Dr. Deva Woodly, and today we're going to talk about how does public meaning shape politics and what does active citizenship look like. Dr. Woodly, glad to have you on.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Woodly is a professor at the New School for Social Research, and she's interested in how democratic politics actually happens in the contemporary context. And part of the reason I wanted to have you on is this line where you say that you approach this in a non-traditional way, and I think there's a lot of value in that. That whereas most political science focuses inquiry on institutions, choice, and decision-making, by contrast, you focus your attention on the ways that public meanings define the problems that the polity, that the citizens understand themselves to share, as well the range of choices that we perceive to be before us. And I think sometimes we get stuck in very binary modes of politics that hide very important and simpler ways to solve problems. And so really excited to have you on here. And, again, thank you. If you'd like to talk a little bit about yourself, how you got interested in this topic, would love to hear it.
Sure. Well, gosh, how did I get interested in the topic of civic participation and meaning making? I think it came out of my activism when I was in college, actually. One of the things that I really noticed when I was in college was that, during that time, that was the early 2000s. And during that time, we were doing a lot of organizing around the living wage, and we were doing a lot of organizing around marriage equality and affirmative action, and eventually around war, right, around anti-war stuff. And one of the things that I noticed in doing my activism was that, and I also at the same time became the editor of a kind of a student magazine that was covering these kind of topics. And one of the things that I noticed was that people would develop their understandings about the problems that were facing us, that are facing us. And they would sort of learn what they felt that their positions were, and they would learn the sources that they trusted, and then they would take action, right, and be sort of in community around these topics, which I think is really good. But at the same time, there was less of a value placed on being understood by a wider population. And I thought that there was a disconnect there. And I thought, well, it's not only about developing understanding of the problems that we face, which is very important. And it's also not only about taking action, which is crucial, but it is also about is it that we create a broader understanding about these issues that, impact all of our lives? And indeed, how do we communicate how these issues impact all of our lives and how it, influences or shapes who we think we are in the world, who we think the we is, right? And, what kinds of lives we think are possible and what kinds of communities we want to be. And all of those things are based on, public meaning, what people understand to be the problems we face, who they think ought to be held accountable for those problems, what they think they need to do in the face of those problems, and what possibilities, right, they think are before them. And that is... that question of possibility is one that I'm really interested in and focused on, because I really believe that what we get done is importantly circumscribed or limited by what we think we can get done. And one of the things that frustrates me a lot in political conversations, both inside the academy and in, the world at large, is when people kind of throw up their hands and say it is what it is. Because, I think that is, that is a self-limitation, right? That we don't have to accept, right? Instead, I think the right question is, what do we want, right? What do we want, and how do we get from here to there? And that set of questions, right, is one that requires imagination, that is tempered by practicality, right, and pragmatism, but one that absolutely posits, right, that we can achieve a world in which more people are living and thriving and able to relate to each other, and able to make their lives possible, right? Materially possible. And if that is our goal, then we can't sort of throw our hands up and say, it is what it is, right? Or this is human nature, another one that's a huge pet peeve of mine. But instead, we have to talk about, okay, so if we want this world in which everyone has access to healthcare, in which everyone is able to, have a voice in shaping how their community runs and functions, in which, children are well cared for and parents are supported, and those who are not in nuclear families are able to live in communities of their own design and choosing. If we want to live in a world in which our economic engines do not rely on the devastation of the environment, if we want to live in a world that is not fundamentally characterized by, white supremacy and racial discrimination, if we want those things, then the question is, how do we get from here to there? And it's a long process, right? It's not something that takes place overnight, but it absolutely starts with, having discussions about shared meaning, about what goals we may have in common, and really understanding where we diverge, right? But also not assuming that those cleavages are always insurmountable, or assuming that we're doing the best that humanity can do at this moment, which I think is manifestly untrue.
So much there that I love. Immediately, as you're talking, that's what I feel like even I want to try and accomplish with my podcast, to fasten on one part where you're talking about educating on deeper levels so that we can talk about what the good life is and find alternative solutions and shared action with people who come from what we would normally think of as very different sides of one issue, but we can agree on some completely unrelated issue that actually solves a lot of the problems. And so that really starts with us talking about what is the good life. And that, like you're talking about that possibility of what kinds of lives we think are possible. That's a crucial question. You had something to say, though. Go ahead.
Well, I think also in developing those deeper understandings through this kind of, conversation, is that we find that actually things that we think are unrelated are often not.
That's what, right.
And that's part of what's so amazing about engaging in this kind of conversation and political work. But I will say that it's not just, it's not like people's preferences and personal failings that prevents these kinds of conversations from happening. I think that, part of the reason that we don't have civic discussions, and I'm saying civic and not civil on purpose, right? Part of the reason that we're not having civic discussions is because our political economy, right, our ways of supporting ourselves, our economic life is organized such that it takes up almost all of our time. Right? So we don't have as much time and we don't have as many spaces where we can just simply get together with people, work with other people on shared sort of common local goals, right? Many of us don't have time for that because we're working all the time and we have to work all the time in order to be barely able to support ourselves, right? So I think that political economy that has developed, right, of the always booked and busy, right, has really prevented or limited a lot of our chances for learning how to work together in a civic capacity. And that civic capacity is fundamental to democratic life. And as it starts to fall apart, of course, democratic politics, that is small d democratic politics, also begins to fall apart because we don't have experience working with one another.
Yes. And ooh, that's tough. There's so many ways, different places I want to go with that. But just to kind of put it into the arena, even as we were talking about this, something that I don't want to romanticize it with words like subversion or rebellion, those kind of things. But as I've looked at the values for our family and what's important, we are starting a garden. And part of that is to pull ourselves not completely because we don't have the capacity for that right now, but to pull ourselves out of a lot of the supply system of our current system, right? Our current like capitalist system. And that's not necessarily even in, I don't, the more I've studied economics, the less I feel I know. Like it's very complicated. But I do know that as of right now, I don't get a lot of choice when I go to the grocery store. Like, it's all made by about the same 4 companies when you talk about meat, that kind of thing. And so looking at, and this is why I taught, like, and so maybe this is what you were referring to, and I just want to give a practical and particular example, that by gardening, you give yourself direct access to the necessities of life. And you're able, and so if you, and that obviously, I understand that requires that you have land to garden on, right? Which is a whole, like that, not everyone can do that. And so just to kind of put that in as an example of an alternative solution for like, oh, I need to work 60 hours in order to make a living. And it's like, well, if you have somewhere to live and you have food, then that actually, you might not have to work as much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, that may be true in certain places, depending on, oftentimes gardening, especially at the beginning, is actually pretty expensive.
Right. No, exactly. Right. No. The initial investment. Yes.
Yeah. And I love gardening. So I'm a huge gardener. I particularly love food gardening. I'm a food gardener more than a flower gardener, although I love both. But here's the thing that in my own community, in my own life, that gardening opened up for us. And this is particularly during the first part of the pandemic, right? So this is spring 2020, right? Which is when I really started gardening in earnest. Before that, I had a few things in pots, But it opened up the capacity for mutual aid, right? Because if you, if you plant a garden and your garden is producing, it's not only that it feeds you and your family. You'll find actually that if it goes well, it produces too much to feed your family, right? And so what we did as a community during that time period, and I didn't lead this, right? I was just merely a participant. Another more experienced gardener in our community was like, look, we have all this surplus. We can provide fresh, organic food to our community just by pooling our resources.
Yes.
And so that's what we did. Right. So, and that is not only about providing for a particular need and taking care of your community, but it's also, importantly, civically, it teaches people how to work together for a concrete goal that alleviates suffering. But also it teaches people to think about, these are the kinds of capacities that are created by people working together. And then it gives people a different kind of framework for what they might expect, right, from governing institutions and decision makers, right, who are supposed to have, right, all this capacity to coordinate effort and, activity. And it's really changed the character of how, local government relates to, folks, who are, citizens in the community. Now we have a small, we're the smallest city in New York is where I live. So we're a small city. And so we have a relative, it's different on a small scale, but at the same time, this kind of engagement has empowered people to run for local office, right? Who have connections to these kinds of mutual aid activities that we were able to put together, who gained experience in doing things like once the mutual aid organization was set up to distribute food, they also were able to pull in local artists and create a outdoor childcare basically a program that had like an arts enrichment component because it happens to be an arty town. So parents who were working from home or who were out of work were able to come in and provide that service. So the whole point is all these good things happened, but also it made everyone civically engaged in a different way. And also in a way where you don't have to be heroic, right? you're getting together with other people to do what you can, where you can, and you're also learning the capacity of collective action so that if you reach a point where some decision maker who has way more capacity, who collects taxes so they have way more money, right, than you, and they say, oh, we can't do that, just don't know how it's going to be done. You can say, but we already did this with like nothing. So you can figure it out, right? And furthermore, we demand that you do. And if you don't, then one of us, moms or dads, right? You know, or other, you know, otherwise sort of affiliated persons is going to run and take your job, and we'll do it. So
and
you know,
and I even you mentioned, you know, that civic engagement. I think it's a big thing that, I mean, so obviously my context, your context is New York, my context is Central Florida. So, and what I love about this, so we're right on the border of Orange County and Lake County. And Orange County tends to be more of a blue county, you know, Orlando, that area. And then you have Lake County, which is very, it's starting to become more suburban because of Orlando, but it is, tends to be more red. And the thing is, everyone connects on both sides with something like gardening. And what it does is it reduces tensions. It gets people who are different to work together on something they agree with. Like in Central Florida, almost everyone will get behind something like gardening, and everyone sees the benefit. And I'm really pleased that connected with you. That's something that you've done, because it's a different way of approaching some of our problems. And I'm a big fan when you talk about possibility and creativity for solutions, of having these solutions that have multiple branching outcomes that are great, which is what like the outdoor daycare. It's amazing, like when you pull resources outside of some kind of governmental structure, how you can create these powerful communities. And I think that's and remove kind of these binary oppositions, because in a lot of ways we're just kind of stuck sometimes and stalemated at the political level. So I don't. Go ahead.
I mean, I do want to say that I think that our political differences are often real, right? Like, so I'm not actually a person who is like, we need to like end polarization and just find things we agree on. You know, sometimes our political differences are rooted in fundamental values differences, right? You know, and that's important, right? And we need to understand that. But sometimes they're not, right? And sometimes, you know, over time and over the process of working together, there are some people, right, who will come to understand, you know, in many different directions, right, that their political activity actually doesn't accord with the values that they think that they have, right? But that is something, you know, that I think has to come from experience and the experience of working together. So, for example, I was teaching freshmen for the first time in a couple of years. You know, I work at a university, and I had a whole class of freshmen for the first time in like 3 years last year. And they're fantastic. I actually love freshmen. So we are talking about civic participation. This class was actually about participation, right? And we're talking about different kinds of institutional forms that facilitate participation, what kinds of participation you can have in these different institutional forms. And one of the students brings up unions and what unions are about. And one brave student asked and this is one of the reasons I love freshmen too, is that they're often able to just be like, I don't know. I don't know. You know, and one brave student was just like, I just don't know what they do. Like, I know that they exist, and I know that some people that I like them, but I don't know what they do. And so, you know, in this course, we were able to have time and space where I wasn't, you know, sort of lecturing to them about what unions are and what they do, although I did, of course, provide information to them. But that one of the students in the class was able to say, you know what, I've been working retail jobs since I was 16. You know, and I my first retail job was at this company where they wouldn't give us a regular schedule. They could change us up at any time. They could charge us for any items that were stolen while we were working. I'm
not surprised. I've heard these stories.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
That they could dock our pay almost arbitrarily, right? Wage theft, which is a huge problem. And there was nothing we could do about it, right? There was nothing I could do about it, as just this lone person who was subject to these rules. And she said, and then I quit that job. I couldn't take it anymore, and now I'm working at another retail job, but this one is unionized. And at the unionized job, I work regular hours, guarantee the hours that I was promised when I was hired. They certainly can't charge me for theft that happens just while I'm on shift, right? And this person is telling this story of this is the way it works in a way that enlightened the entire class. But from experience, right? From lived experience. It wasn't like ideologically about, particular things. It was very much like, let me just tell you the practical importance of the different experiences I had in these different situations. And none of those students will forget that, right? And so that way of communicating, that's what I mean by having time and space. People who are lucky enough to, go to schools that are well funded or go to university level schooling are able to have these spaces, right? Where they can just talk about these kinds of things. But it's much harder in our regular lives. That kind of thing is usually organized out of our, existence because we're trying to work those jobs, right? And that is something that's really, really missing because, people who may think that they're aligned on one side or the other of an issue, like unions, because, an opinion leader that they listen to has an opinion about it, right? Would discover a different kind of relationship, right, to that idea if they were just able to talk to other people about it.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point. It's something I've felt a lot of. You see these expressions on social media about educate yourself, and I tried to, right? But there's so many issues, and so many of them are important. And then you look at if you have kids, and you work a full-time job, and you run your household, the idea of at the end of the day you're going to pick up. I'm going to have Dr. Lewis Gordon on to talk about his book, Fear.
Oh, yes.
Talk about Fear of Black Consciousness. It's his book that just came out. And I'm reading the book, and I love it. But if I've had a long day with the kids, it's not 9 o'clock at night after trying to work with my 4-year-old all day that I'm like, I'm going to crack open this book on political philosophy. I mean, it's difficult, right? And you have to be very committed. And even then, sometimes you're just too tired. And so I just really appreciate that. And I wanted to say this because I want to make sure I didn't, I just want to clarify. I agree 100% on not eradicating difference. So when you talked about when I talked about working together to find solutions, it's just not where we have stalemates, I don't want to eradicate that because those are important differences. But there are places where we can work together. And sometimes, and this is, I think, what you were mentioning, it can shed new light on what we think are stalemates, right? Some stalemates are real and some are not. But we also have a lot of stuff that we could fix and that we're just not talking about. So I wanted to say I agree. And I feel like, I could be wrong, but I feel like I agree 100% with what you said about that. So I wanted to make sure I clarified that. You said something, and I'm I do like. It's amazing how people love to talk about pet peeves. So you mentioned you mentioned you don't like the term human nature. Talk to me. Why don't you like the term human nature?
Because I think it's another arbitrary limiting factor, right? You can say anything is human nature, right?
Okay.
You know what I mean? You can say, like, it's human nature to love chocolate, right? And it's just like, actually, not everybody loves chocolate. Like, that's, and when you talk about more complicated things that have to do with behaviors, I think you're really in a situation where you're just, there's no way, first of all, to verify that, right? And as an empirically based person, I'm just like, you can't tell me that's true, right? Like, but I also think that it forms an ideological, like it does ideological work. That's just not warranted, and it limits what we think is possible, right? If we think human nature is such and such a thing, right? So this is another example from my class. So if you think that it is that no matter what the situation is, people are going to be self-interested and fight for what they can get for themselves at the expense of anyone and everyone else, right? Now, of course, we have a lot of anecdotes. We have our own impulses to say, oh, that's human nature. But of course, we have a lot of anecdotes and we have a lot of personal examples where that's not the case, right? And so there's some external factor that's mitigating that. But beyond that, right, which I think of as just empirically true, there's also what assumptions are at play when you say something is human nature. So in my class, I asked them the question, we're talking about different ways to sort of organize economies, different ways to organize society, and what do you think would happen, if you're in a situation where everybody kind of needs the same things, but they're not allocated in an equal way, right? And one of the students is like, well, I would definitely get what I could for me and my family, and I don't, that maybe that's bad, but I don't feel bad about that. And so then I asked them, well, what is the underlying assumption, right? Or what are the underlying assumptions in something like that? And another student in the class said that there's not enough. Right. And that was a moment of like another sort of like epiphany moment for the whole class. It's like that. Yes. Right. Yeah. Under conditions of scarcity, it makes total sense that you want to ensure your life and the life of the people who are closest to you. Right. But that assumes, right, if we build a whole political system on that, we're making the assumption that there's not enough. Forever and ever, right? And that there's no way that we can ensure that there's enough, right? And if you work from that assumption, right, of course, then behaviors will, react to the circumstances as they are, right? And I'm not a utopian, so I don't mean that like everyone will be able to have everything and everyone will be happy and well forever and ever. I don't mean that. I mean that if you start from the assumption that, we have enough technology, we have enough people, we have, enough space, right, in the world, right, that we can, commit ourselves to figuring out how we can make everyone housed, how we can make sure everyone has access to food, how we can make sure that everyone has access to health care. And that's just our baseline. We want to make sure there's enough of all of that. This is not the 18th century where it's like literally maybe impossible, right, to do that. We are in a space now, right, where it's not literally impossible to do that. The question is, how do we do it, right? That should be the place that you start from, So that's what I mean. We have to question the assumptions about what we think our limitations are, not because there are no limitations or because everything can be perfect, but because we can stop ourselves from doing what we actually can do by simply the limit of our imagination.
Yeah, and that I definitely feel that. I mentioned I don't remember if it was before we started really recording, but the transition from being I used to be a teacher to being a small business owner, and realizing how much I'd been taught, even as a kid, that you get a job, you get paid for your time, and not your value in your work. And one of the biggest things I had to switch was like, and it's incredibly freeing, and people just don't hear it and they don't see it because we're taught, like, go get a good job, those kind of things. And then you see there's a whole class of people who grew up with entrepreneurial parents who are taught, like, it doesn't matter how long you work. What matters is that you get the job done. And that's it. But we have these initial just trains of thought, and if we don't start with deconstructing what that is at the beginning, then you're just kind of stuck, like, well, I have to have this job, because if I don't have this job, how am I going to feed my family? And there's a lot of different resources and that's the very small thing, and that's a personal example, right? But communally, we can do these things too.
Right. I mean, we have to start asking questions about, okay, what actually is impossible and what is actually possible, right? I mean, that is where we kind of begin. And you see this play out in large and small ways, right? I mean, for me, I was just absolutely astonished, for example, when the press secretary, Jen Psaki, right, of Biden administration's press secretary, was asked, and this was, now maybe a month and a half ago, what are you going to, do to make tests and masks, like, available to, more people? And the press secretary laughed and said, what do you want us to send them for free to every American? Right. And it's something. I was,
yeah.
Okay, but beyond,
well, we can do the vaccines for free,
right?
Okay,
I mean, it was like, this is a failure of, this is absolutely stopping yourself from imagining what is possible, and it's not even a far imagination, right? Other countries do this, like, it's completely within the purview, right, of a government to do this, right? But the idea that no, we can't send things to care for people to them for free because somehow that contravenes the American way, right? That's a limitation that doesn't have to be there. And it starts with absolutely having the wrong assumptions and asking the wrong questions. And, the good news, I hope, is that people are beginning not to accept that kind of limitation, and particularly people who organize in social movements, right? And that's what social movements are about, right? They're about people not accepting the limitation of whatever the social mores is, what the law is, right, at the moment, what the government says that it can do, will do, should do, and will provide. And it's people who are getting together and saying, actually, according to our experience and according to what we have discovered, right, because that's the other thing that people don't recognize, is that social movements are very well studied, actually. Most of the time, right? Like a huge part of being in movement is like gathering information and facts about what the issue is. And those people getting together and saying, actually, we have alternatives and we have to pursue those alternatives, right? Because otherwise I'm not going to be able to live an equal, dignified, free, thriving life, right? And neither are all of these other people, and maybe neither are you, right? Because it turns out that these struggles are very much connected, right? Struggles for racial justice, struggles for housing affordability, struggles for environmental protection, struggles among the for the working class. All of these struggles are connected, right? And it is about people getting together, educating themselves and each other, learning together, right? How it is we can solve these problems, what we have to demand, what we have to dismantle, what we have to rebuild in order to make thriving lives possible.
So as we think about that, I'd like to, we've talked quite a bit about participation, and I think we've mentioned a little bit about public meaning, but how do you shape public meaning to create more possibilities?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that social movements that last do. And it's not easy, right? Like, that's the other thing, is that, shaping public meaning is about combining values, right? Old ideas that people already have, through people's understanding of the world as it is, with new purposes, right, that present a vision of the world as it could be, right, or should be. Okay, so it's a kind of a three-step process. You start where people are, you bring them through the kind of story and evidence of lived experience, and say it's actually possible to do things a different way, right? And when social movements are able to do that, and I call that making resonant arguments, when social movements are able to make these resonant arguments over time, what they do is they change the baseline of how people evaluate certain problems, right? Some people talk about this as shifting the Overton window, although that's usually among elites, in decision-making sessions like legislatures, et cetera. What I talk about is among the whole population, right? It's the shift from the notion of same-sex marriage to the notion of marriage equality, right? It's a change in public meaning, right? It is a shift in, thinking that unions are on the way out and the living wage is a nice idea, but it would never work, to a resurgence in organizing for unions and people understanding that actually workers deserve to have a dignified life where they're able to set the terms on which their labor will be, utilized, right? And the ways that they are able to determine their own value, right? That is a shift in kind of public meaning, right? What it means to evaluate these political problems. In the case of racial justice, it is a shift, right? In thinking through discrimination as an individual, interpersonal, feelings-based enterprise, and thinking about instead the notion of systemic and institutional racism, right? How racist impacts and discriminatory impacts are not just about, mean people doing mean things, but is instead about the rules, laws, and institutional practices that keep people of color, especially Black and Indigenous people, from being able to live thriving lives, right? And so, all of these things are shifts in the baseline way that many people, right, most people understand an issue. And it's really important to understand that shifts in public meaning don't mean that everyone's in agreement, right, about these issues. Like, democracy is hard, right? Everybody is not going to be in agreement, but it is a shift in the baseline understandability, right? Intelligibility, right? Of what the dimensions of a problem are. And when we understand a problem differently, the solutions that we consider will also be different.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And that's why shifts in public meaning are so important. And that's why that's some of the most fundamental work that social movements do. Now, these kinds of shifts in public meaning do not have a one-to-one correspondence with policy wins, right? Especially as these meanings are being introduced. What I found in my work on marriage equality and living wage, the living wage movement, was that actually there's a period of backlash, right? Which we are also experiencing in terms of racial justice movements right now. That happens after the idea is introduced, or the set of ideas are introduced and gain salience. There is a pushback, right? There's a political pushback, a regressive push that wants to maintain the status quo, whatever it is. And those regressive pushes are often quite successful in the moment. But if movements are able to remain organized and are able to continue with their resonant messaging, the opposition forces are not able to completely control the information environment, right? And also the material environment, then there is a chance for those public meanings to be overcome, right? And we did see this happen, for example, in the marriage equality movement. I don't know if you remember, but that movement organized as such in 1993. And in 2004, of course, Democrats lost the presidential election, and there was a huge slew, right, of all this blame, like it was the gay people's fault, trying to allow them to, it was absolutely them. We need to stop talking about those issues, right? Like, I don't know if you remember this discourse, but it was, it's there, right, in the public record.
I was 16, so Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
Well, that is what happened.
Yes,
right?
yeah. I'm tracking with you. Yeah.
Yes, I was in, I think, graduate school at the time. So, and so I absolutely remember those conversations happening, and it became like this mainstream talking point that it was absolutely the gays, like they were the reason.
Yeah.
And Democrats need to stop messing with them because they're just going to continue to lose, right? Of course, that movement remained mobilized, even though it was demoralized, fractious. It wasn't an easy time, right? But of course, then within 4 years, public opinion completely shifted on that issue, right? Now, it didn't happen sort of inevitably. It happened because those same resonant arguments about what was at stake, right, in that debate, right, kept being made. And the counter arguments came to seem less and less credible. They were also less unified, right, than the arguments for. And the counter arguments also came to, and I think this is really important, did not match up with people's experience of the world. Right. In a way that helped people make sense of the world. Most people. Yeah. Right. Not all people, but most
it's
people.
Never all people.
I'm always, that's right. I'm always dealing with majorities. I'm never saying all people, right? And that really matters, right? So now as we're dealing with a really severe backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement, to the idea, which had, just gained salience, at least in mainstream politics, of systemic racism, right? That's what the sort of critical race theory backlash is all about. It's a counter argument to the notion of systemic racism, which had finally gotten some traction, really. We're in the midst of a very severe backlash where, many states have moved to outlaw the teaching of critical race theory, whatever they think that is, but that's also expanded to pulling books that are just by Black authors off library shelves, same with the notion in sort of policing, right? We have this media narrative about a crime wave that is actually empirically not happening, and also might, we'll talk about that, right? No, that's a whole point that I also talk about. But anyway, all of this, people are responding to that with the notion that actually police need more money, more authority, more and that the notion of defund is sort of dead on arrival, right? Et cetera. So, we're experiencing a similar kind of backlash now, right? That we have seen before with other successful movements, right? With marriage equality, 33 states passed constitutional amendments to ban same-sex marriage, right? This is always a struggle, right? It's always a contest, and there are steps forward and steps back. The question is, for me, how are public meanings being shaped? What kinds of new ways are people thinking about issues and problems? So, for example, one of my favorite examples of this is with the notion of defunding the police, right? So any kind of mainstream pundit will tell you that's a horrible idea, it's a horrible slogan, why are they saying that, right? Et cetera. And they're wrong for a number of different reasons. One, they're wrong on the merits, right? American policing institutions have more money than any other kinds of policing institutions in the world. They have more money than any of our other public services, which also means that policing institutions are overburdened in terms of what it is they're expected to do, right? People who are involved in law enforcement will also tell you this, like, I'm expected to be a social worker, and I'm expected to alleviate poverty, and I'm expected to stop armed criminals, and I'm expected to deal with mental health crises, right? And the reason that they're expected to do all that is because we've dumped almost all of our discretionary money into policing. Right.
We're not paying teachers very much, but we have people in Missouri buying tanks. Right.
It doesn't make sense, right? Like, so, it focuses all the resources toward one institution that cannot do all these jobs.
Yeah.
Right. And should not be expected to do all of these jobs. Right. Instead, we need to invest in the things that can actually do these jobs. Right. So one, on the merits, they're wrong. But two, in terms of messaging, they're also wrong. Because one of the things that social movements do is they bring into focus ideas that are currently outside what we think is possible. Right. And if they do so successfully, those ideas linger in the public consciousness, even if they linger as objects that people are objecting to. Right. So this notion that, defund is the wrong slogan. What we should really say is, refund communities, or defund is the wrong slogan. What we should really say is retrain. Right. What we should really say is reinvest in education and housing and et cetera. People don't understand that while we're having that conversation,
it's already working. It's already working.
That's the money.
Yes.
That's because even as, and it's really frustrating, right? Even as municipalities dump more money into policing, right, at this moment, people are beginning to understand, actually, there are all these things that we're not investing in that I want us to be investing in. And we actually have the option and opportunity to do that. And in localities, right, it's already happening, right? Defunding is not necessarily happening yet, right? At least not in significant ways. But it's already happening that municipalities are trying to invest in other ways to ensure safety, right, where they are, and imagining different possibilities for their discretionary funds. And it's also happening that when the question is put to the public, for example, in referenda, right, and such, right, and some of those referenda were on the ballot in 2020, people are choosing not to increase funding to their police departments and instead to put money into other kinds of things. And the people who choose that are not necessarily wearing a banner, right, that says defund police. It's just an assessment about, do I think that this organization needs more money? They seemed really well resourced, or do I want to have more in terms of investing in parks, affordable housing, food, right, et cetera, right? So, anyway, so having the conversation over time, right, in a way that is, organized by organizers and advocates who understand what is at stake and what their message is something that shapes public meaning over time and makes new things politically possible. But it's not overnight, right? It's not from one election cycle to another. You usually have to look, I've found, over a decade, right, to see how public meaning changes. Because, the way that people think about their lives and what's possible and how the world is takes time to shift. And you're not guaranteed the outcome that you want, of course, but it's important to understand how the process works.
And so I think if there's one thing that people would take away from this, and it's part of the reason I wanted to do this podcast, and I keep bringing that up, but it's why I wanted to have you on, and I'm excited about this, is that slogans in many ways are more like keys than platforms. And I think where people get frustrated is they see, like, defund the police, it's like, no money for the police. And there are some people who say just completely abolish it, but that doesn't, it's not what it is. It's a discussion. Defund the police is a discussion, and that, like you said, it's about creating that discussion. It's like, well, not defund, it's refund this. And it's like, well, that's all part of what we're doing, which is why even you said that it's not, you're not necessarily going to get the results that you want, like maybe the exact results, but you might get some of the results, and sometimes that might be because you're wrong. There's a better solution over here, if that makes sense. Where people talk through that discussion. When I say you there, I mean generally you, not like.
No, absolutely,
obviously you're wrong, Dr. Woodly. No, that wasn't where I was going at. So it's funny. You mentioned earlier, and we were talking about how racism isn't just about mean people being mean. And the example that I thought of immediately is racism movies. A lot of times people are like, oh, I watched this movie, and, racism is bad. And it does, it's good to get people thinking about that and to give these illustrations of courage, but it often is like, oh, just racism is like mean people doing mean things. And in some ways it shuts, and I think this is an important part of all this public meaning shaping, is that it just shuts down the conversation. Because it's like, well, don't be a mean person and don't do mean things. And that's like, that's not what we're really talking about here. I mean, obviously you don't want those things, right? Like, but that's already becoming increasingly unpopular without solving many of the actual outstanding issues.
Well, and that's partly why discussion about systemic issues is really important. This is one thing that's really important, generally speaking, in American society, is how is it that we have public conversations that help people think structurally and systemically, right? One of the things about the American sort of version of individualism, particularly when we're thinking about politics, is that we've come to think that it's all about individual interactions with other individuals, or that individuals inherently know what their interest, right? This notion of interest, right? They inherently know what their interest is and are going to like automatically fight for that, right? In coalition with other people who share their interests that they inherently know. And that's not actually how the world works, right? All of our lives, we make individual choices. Some of them are better and some of them are worse. But the fact is that we all live under conditions that are not of our own making, right? We are born into a world that already exists.
Last
and we
I
have
checked,
to work. Right? Like, it's not made new just because we kind of walk into it, even though we are irreducible snowflakes, each and every one of us. And I mean that in the best possible way, right? Like, the world exists. And so the fact is that when we're thinking about change, right? Social change, political change on a large or small scale, we have to understand that the thing that we want to change is not only our own behavior, right? Not even primarily our own behavior. It is really about, how is it that we can shift the conditions of our lives, right? All of our lives in such a way that we can, limit, right? Diminish discrimination, limit and diminish inhumanity, limit and diminish the suffering that people undergo, right? And all of that is not going to be only about our own like mindfulness and yoga practice and therapy, although yes, to all of those things. It is about how do we have access to institutions that are able to, and see it as their mission to, provide for our collective needs, right? And so thinking about systems and structures is one of, I think, the key things that we can do civically, right, to come to understand the scope of the problems that we face and the scope of the solutions that are necessary, right? And I see this, particularly in the case of environmental, issues, right? The scope of the problem that we face, in terms of the possibility of this planet being habitable for human beings, most human beings, in the next 100 years, is not something that is going to be solved by making sure that we put our own individual things in recycling bins, right? Like, that's not answering the scope of the question. Right. And so when we talk about those issues, thinking about things systemically and structurally is really the first step to trying to meet the challenges of the 21st century.
Well said. Absolutely appreciate that. One of the things, for me, questions of race didn't even really pop up on my radar because I lived for a long time, 9 years, an hour and a half north of Green Bay, Wisconsin. So we were at a college that I knew 4 black people the entirety of my time there because it's just predominantly white. And so even as you're talking about these issues, there's an enormous amount of misinformation. And one of the things we don't talk about, I think enough, is that there are multiple modes of knowing. And so when we talk about, for instance, like a lot of stuff that I was just confused at why the conversation was going the way it was going when I would hear about politics and stuff like that made way more sense once I moved to Chicago. Like, I was like, oh, okay, now, like, this makes way more sense. Whereas, like, the issues that someone's facing in rural Wisconsin, in rural Upper Peninsula Michigan, is very different, right? And so, just kind of even going back to, we were talking about gardening, we were talking about these social movements, whatever it is, where you're working together and you just, like, rub shoulders with and work with different people is just very important. And that kind of leads me into, I want to be respectful of your time. We're drawn to a close here. How do you create resonance? So resonant arguments. And I think that's, just a really essential and important part of this, because there is an enormous amount of misinformation, and a lot of people don't even realize what their interests are, right? So how do you create resonance?
Well, okay, so the process for creating a resonant argument is actually that three-step process I talked about before. Is one, old ideas, right? Things that values that people already hold. That's meeting people where they are. Organizers also talk about that, right? And connecting them to new purposes, right? Through people's experience, right? So people's lived experience. So it's a sort of three-pronged thing. So this is one of the reasons that resonant arguments are very rarely purely ideological arguments, right? And when I say that, I don't, what I mean is speaking from inside of an ideology that is not commonly well known, right, or that is massively stereotyped for whatever reason, right, is not one that's going to usually create a resonant argument, even if the sort of basis of the argument is correct or true, right, in some capacity. Instead, it really is about starting where people are, right, and figuring out how to articulate a problem, right, in such a way that people acknowledge it as a problem because they've experienced it in their own lives. And then offering a set of solutions, right, or a way of looking at things that helps people to understand that those solutions, that way of looking at the problem actually can, help to solve it, right, in a way that comports with the values that they already hold. Right. And so, for example, this is what happened with the marriage equality movement, because people, and I wrote about a book about this, but also articles, but, people, a majority of people, because of social mores, because of their religious commitments, or at least the way they understood their religious commitments at the time, had an idea that with the issue of same-sex marriage, what was at stake was whether or not they personally, found same sex, appealing or not, right? And that sort of framing or that way of thinking about things, or they thought that there was a mandate from their religious affiliation, that they had to condemn, these, again, sexual acts. So it was about sex, basically. And so what happened in the sort of reframing of that debate is that, what activists said is like, this is not about sex. This is about family, and this is about love, and this is about the rights to the resources that we need to live in loving community. Right? That is what is at stake. Not about however you feel about the kind of sex that we're having, or however I feel about the kind of sex you're having, right? That was an argument. And the way that people were able to do that is to say, you already value this notion of equality. You already value the notion of love and a loving family. And let me tell you how this issue is about those things that you already value. And that if you value those things, then you ought to value the access to this institution. And, there's a really weird moment in public opinion polling where you have the majority of people both against same-sex sexual acts and for marriage equality. Yeah. Right? So it's because the decision rule for what was at stake, right, in that debate changed. Yeah. The decision about whether or not I support this wasn't based on how I feel about your sex, right?
Which is a weird thing. Which is a weird thing to be concerned about, right?
It's very, but people are, I don't know. But okay, so now this is a limited example, right? And people will sort of like tell you that it's like, this is a very, this wasn't an example that required the changing of the fundamental structures of society in the way that a reorganization of the labor market would, in a way that the defeat, right, of, white supremacy would. This is a much more sort of limited case in that it only required, inclusion in institutions that already existed, right? It didn't require a kind of restructuring of those. And that's true, right? That's a fair critique. And yet at the same time, we can see how people's minds changed on this issue, which nevertheless seemed very out of the ordinary, seemed at first when it was introduced sort of definitionally absurd. That was one of the most frequent arguments against marriage equality, is that it didn't make sense. Right? Like, I just don't even know. It's not even marriage, right? If it's right. So, people really had to get their minds around something that for them was totally outside the box, right? So that means that when you're asking people to get their minds around something that is totally outside the box and requires the restructuring of society, that's an even longer fight. But I think it proceeds in the same way. Right, is that people learn that what's at stake in the issue is something different than they originally thought. And so then they start to make different policy choices, right, even if they haven't yet, or they never, right, changed their mind about whatever kind of values commitment they had, right, in the beginning that was inhibiting them from supporting. So this is also, another lesson in terms of defund, right? Even people who would not necessarily say, like, carry this banner of defund the police, or who are not abolitionists and who would never, have an ACAB sticker on their car or whatever, they still might think, actually, it's a bad idea to spend 50% of our discretionary budget on the police department.
Yeah.
Right? What's at stake in that argument is different. Right? And when you change that baseline through the use of resonant arguments, then you make things politically possible that weren't politically possible before. Yeah. And that is, for me, that is the heart of social change. And the kind of social change that I'm talking about doesn't have to be reformist social change. It can also be large scale or revolutionary social change in the broad sense of the restructuring of society. Not necessarily the sense of war, right? When you're in a war situation, everything is different, right? But this process works whether you're on a large scale or a small scale, whether your goals are reformist or whether they are radical. The question is the way that you're describing things helping people make sense of the world, right, in a different way? Right. And one of the reasons for the huge upheaval that we're having right now is that the sort of things that we have been told, even in your example of a small business and working job, et cetera, the things that we have been told about how to organize our lives, right, that may have served in the 20th century, no longer help us make sense of our lives. And so people are reaching for all these different explanations. And some are radical and progressive, and some are fascist and regressive, and some is just confusion, right? But it's because there isn't this correspondence of, do the ideas that are circulating, right, in public, the things that we are told are baseline common sense, do those things actually help us make sense of the conditions in our lives? And often the answer is no. So the project of the 21st century is, how do we create a correspondence, right, between the ideas that we hold about how we ought to organize our lives and society, right, and the material conditions that we face in society? And that is what movements are trying to help us do right now.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to do like a clarifying, just to restate kind of what you're talking about. I grew up fundamentalist Christian, and so I grew up with a lot of debates about whether women should be able to wear pants, whether rock music was of the devil. Okay, so there was a lot more argument, I think, than in my community than in normal communities, because people were trying to make sense of their lives in regards to like these kind of things. But what I found especially persuasive, and I'm wondering if this fits in with what you're saying, is that when someone did resist an idea, the important thing wasn't to even bowl them over with arguments, though ultimately, like you are talking about arguments, but the rhetorical strategy I often found most effective was find what they are protecting and show them how what you're describing actually is a better example of what they're protecting. Is that fitting with what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. So if what people are concerned about is safety, then show people how dumping all of our discretionary funds into policing does not create safety, and actually having green space and housing and adequate food, that's what creates safety. Right. I think that's an absolutely wonderful way of putting it, is that when people are fighting so hard for a particular idea, it's often because they are protecting something. Right. And so if you can show them a way to preserve or protect or improve that thing, right, then you can find common ground. But this is also with the caveat that if what they're protecting is truly despicable, then there is no common ground. And you have to just...
That's the polarizing...
but you have to be able to...
That's the stalemate. Right. But what I found specifically, because I literally went to this college, it was fundamentalist, went to being evangelical in the 9 years we were there. So everything changed. Literally people like, and it's a college, it's an academic setting. So you have students in the dorm talking till 2 a.m. every night about theology. So this is like, this is why I do this now. Because I like it, right? It's like, this is, and so what I found was if you can isolate what individual people are protecting, the people who are despicable in what they're protecting tend to be quite the minority. But it seems like they have common ground with a lot of people, but they actually don't. And so that's why it's very important to find out what is like, so, well, we don't need to get into specific examples from there because a lot of it's just weird and nobody cares. But honestly, but like with things like, when someone's like, well, no, I actually just don't like black people. Like most people are like, what? No, you know what I mean? Like that like you start to isolate the people wwho are problematic. Does that make sense?
No, I think that's true. I mean, in the sense that I think that you absolutely have to figure out what it is you're disagreeing about with.
Yeah.
So if what you're disagreeing about is the idea that actually there are some humans that are just better than other humans, and everything about our society should reflect that. Well, that's a fundamental disagreement, and we have no common ground. If it is something else, right, then what we have is something that we need to talk through and about, which doesn't mean that we'll agree in the end, but it does mean that we can be a part of the same conversation. So I absolutely agree with you. And I also want to lift up this tradition of civitas that you talked about, right? Like this notion that you guys, and that's why college is special, right? Is that like you guys had the time and space to discuss and debate ideas. And in the discussing and debating of those ideas, there's also community that's created, right? This is also another reason to get the political economy under control, because just giving people time and space to discuss ideas and work together, and this is why also reinvesting in the public and public spaces, right, is also important, because those spaces where people can kind of get together and whatever, play chess or, whatever they're doing and just talk. You know what I mean? Just those are really, really important spaces for nurturing the capacity for democratic politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. If you could leave one thing to our audience, what would it be?
I would say find a way to get involved locally, right? I would say that one of the most important things that we can do, in addition to, you know, everything that you say about like educate yourself, right, et cetera, we actually have better education in community. And so to get involved locally about something that you care about and to try to find ways of carrying that sort of forward, right, in your own local space and community, and understanding how that local space and how that local set of fights, right, whatever they are, connect to a broader political story. For me, that's the most critical work of democracy right now, is making those connections between the concrete and local and the larger in terms of national and even global. But I think that absolutely starts with understanding what's going on where you are.
Thank you, Dr. Woodly. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a pleasure too. Thank you.